All right, I think I'm recording now. So today I wanted to cover a little bit of some precursors on the inflammation talk and the inflammation video that I'm going to be doing here either tonight or tomorrow. And these will be posted pretty much at the same time. The reason that I wanted to start with the topic of glycemic index and load is because it kind of sets the groundwork where you're able to connect kind of the two dots, where if I just talk about inflammation, and a lot of doctors have talked about inflammation as a whole, people go, yeah, we heard about it, or we heard the tip of the iceberg. And a lot of the times people like to just ignore the rest of the iceberg hidden under the water. And this is just one of my attempts to kind of shine a different light or a different angle that everybody may not have heard when it comes to inflammation. So today's talk, we're going to talk about glycemic index and the glycemic load and why it's kind of an important thing. I got a couple other tabs up here in the search bar that I'm going to be going through. So just a very rough overview of the pancreas, how things tie in with your digestive system, and we'll go for there. Again, this is going to be a very general video. I'm hoping to keep this right around 10 minutes. And as I said in almost all my other videos, if you want to know more, just let me know, because each one of these is just hours upon hours upon hours of material in each one of these that we could be doing. But I digress. Let's dive in. So this first article is actually just from the Harvard Medical School. I thought it was just the most succinct way of figuring out what the difference is between glycemic index and glycemic load. To kind of break down some of the terminology, glycemic basically deals with glucose and sugar and how your body responds to the different sugar. The index itself is basically a rating system where nutritionists and biochemists got together and they kind of rated how each food has a number from 0 to 100 based upon how much it's broken down into pure sugar. So glucose or table sugar is pure 100. I honestly forget what they made it 0, so no food at all. And how all the foods range in between. Now, typically your veggies are on the lower end. Some meats range right in the lower end and right in the middle. Fruits, depending upon how much fiber they have in there, are typically going to be on the higher end, as well as your starches. But it's a matter of not necessarily fearing the actual index number, but then taking that index number and figuring out its actual load to your system. So even though some foods, and I think they got a good example in here, may have a high index number, when you actually put it in perspective, the actual load it has on your body is low, and vice versa. Some of those foods that are in the mid-range, even though the index number is low, the amount that is usually consumed per serving is what makes the load on your body pretty high. And that plays a really big role in your overall inflammation throughout your system, which we'll be talking about in the next video. So to basically break it down, you can see the load right here in the picture. So its load is equal to the index times the carbs you eat divided by 100. And if you want to read the actual article, you can find it online, or you can pause this video at any point and actually just break it down. The long story is basically what I told you, sorry, the short story is what I told you, where foods on a scale of 0 to 100, pure sugar being 100, and then fiber and fatty foods, it's usually in the lower GI. Another interesting thing here is typically the more processed the food is, it's higher GI, just something to keep in mind, which is why you'll always hear me harp on less processed foods overall. It's typically in the manufacturing process. So when you think about processed foods, think of potato chips, candy bars, things that are really high in the additives. But going down to my previous point on here, it's going to be this section right here dealing with watermelon. So watermelon, a fruit, mostly water and a lot of sugar, very high in the index, and 80. So it's up there. But the average serving of watermelon, it has so little actual carbohydrate. And so you remember my other video, it's 4 grams or 4 calories per gram. You don't get a lot of grams out of watermelon since it's mostly water. So if we take that index and we multiply it by the carbs that you get on average and then divide it by 100, the actual load to your body is relatively small. Now, I'm not advocating you go out there and eat watermelon upon watermelon and go on this weird weight loss diet. I mean, interesting. I'm a fan. I love watermelon, but that's not what I'm saying here. It's just putting things into perspective. So why is it important to understand what glycemic load does to my body. And to kind of answer that question, see if I can do this without clicking interrupting Zoom here, is to understand the basic nature of your digestive system. And to do that, I want to talk a little bit about the pancreas. Now, the pancreas has two main functions. The main functions are aiding in digestion, so helping the gallbladder break down fats and helping your stomach break down some of the food that's gone through your system, but also, and one that everybody knows, is release insulin from beta cells. Now, to kind of put things in perspective here, if you follow my cursor right above here where my cursor is circling, you'd find the bottom end of your stomach. The stomach would exit with a little sphincter over here and come straight down into the duodenum, which is the first part of the intestine. And it's right here where on the left side, you would have your gallbladder, and they cut it out here, but you see these green tubes. This is your bile ducts from the gallbladder, and they combine together right here in part of the duodenum to digest fatty foods or any food in general, but the gallbladder in particular, it's fatty foods. Now, it's important to note that the pancreas as well, as I stated, from the beta cells releases insulin based upon how much glucose is coming into your system. So it's very responsive and reactive to what's going on in your body. So if you have a very steady diet, high in fiber, you're not overloading on any one particular meal, so your meal sizes are relatively even, the actual glycemic load to your body is pretty steady throughout the day, it's going to meter out insulin at a pretty steady state. Now, if you just, Thanksgiving dinner, you just go ham on the ham, the turkey, the sweet potatoes, all the syrupy goodness, everything in there, that load is going to be massive to your body. Your pancreas is just going to be dishing out insulin. I mean, just pouring it on out as fast as it can. The reason this is important, and you typically associate with, oh, well, I'm not a diabetic, so it's no big deal. I don't need to really worry about overloading myself 1 or 2 times. You're right, 1 or 2 times isn't the worst thing in the world. The problem is, and I got to be careful that I don't dip into what I want to talk about with the inflammation video, is just how much more constant we have these elevated glucose levels in our body, and why our pancreas just keeps pushing out more and more insulin than it really should. This is why we get insulin insensitivity or resistance, which is a pre-diabetic state. And the problem with that is we only see the end result of systemic long sustained inflammation in the form of actual disease. So if we're talking about stages here, let's say, stage 1, perfectly healthy, no big deal. Stage 4, full blown disease. Most Americans, over 60% of Americans, are in stages 2 and 3, which is this low grade heightened inflammatory state. And this is from our diet, our sedentary lifestyle, and it leads to a lot of bad things in the background. And when we understand it from a glycemic load aspect, where it's just like, well, my diet's okay, it's not great. McDonald's once in a while, it's okay. If you compare it to each other, if we're saying that the average is bad and I'm right around the average, what are we really saying here? To kind of bring myself back to not jumping on so many different tangents and dipping into the next video, glycemic load is important because once we understand we are overloading our system with the food that we're putting into it, we understand why we are in this chronic state of low grade to moderate grade inflammation. This inflammation leads to very bad things throughout our life, and it leads to a lot of things that people don't consider. The human body is fantastic in the sense that it's adaptable to so many different things, but it comes at a cost. We don't notice when some of these systemic things that we can't personally feel, like pain is pretty easy. I can pinch right here and I can feel that. But if I have any actual inflammation going on throughout my system, it doesn't always come forward in my perceptions. And what I mean by that is your brain will kind of put things off in the background until it becomes a huge issue, at which point you've got a lot of work to dial it back. So if we just understand that we don't necessarily have to feel this inflammation for it to be happening, we might be able to take a little bit more of a proactive approach so we don't wind up in the stage 4, where you wind up with bad things like diabetes, fatty liver disease, or we wind up with anything associated with excess time as an obese person. If we, like atherosclerosis, heart disease, all of these things can be affected by how we just, I'm going to say a doughy moment here, but by our lifestyle, but in part by our food and our constant over excessive desire to eat these high glycemic load foods. So some of these I'm going to be talking about come tomorrow. So we've got inflammation, some of the obvious things, some of the not so obvious things. But the other thing that I wanted to show you is just kind of the index and some of the interesting things when you actually look at the indexes for some of the foods. So pretty common around here, potatoes. You know, Saturday morning, I go to the local diner. They serve hash browns as one of my sides. Potatoes are pretty ubiquitous. They are French fries, hash browns. You cook them for anything from, you know, like breakfast, you know, like I said, hash browns, but you got, what's the term? Irish boxies or like potato cakes, mashed potatoes, sweet potatoes. They're everywhere and a pretty common food. What I want to draw your attention to is first the index, which I actually find really interesting here. So we just take potatoes, different breeds of potatoes, and then depending upon how we cook them, you're actually going to wind up with a different glycemic index. Now, they go above 100 here, and I think that's just because they want to impact you on how high it is. So it's not that it's worse than sugar, but that's what they're just trying to get at, is it's really, really high. And this is from the University of Sydney, so they might be working off a slightly different index than the one that I indicated. However, most of them are going to be pretty similar. You're going to get similar numbers throughout. Just type it into Google. But that's the thing that I found fascinating, is even if we just go with one generic food, depending on the species of food it is or the brand and how you cook it, it's going to have a different index associated with it, and how much sugar content or how your body's going to respond to it. The other thing too is they kept servings, the gram servings, relatively even. But then here's where that equation comes in and plays an important role, is that carbs per serving. And if you put it in that equation, here's the load found throughout your body. So again, high index, if we go for the same serving and it's higher on the carbs per serving, you're going to wind up with a larger glycemic load in your body, where your body's going to have to release more of that insulin. And if we take a look at one of the lower ones on here, this potato white skin baked with a little bit of margarine. I mean, I'm not a huge fan of margarine, except when my grandma bakes it with pies, but that's a side story. Carbs per serving is, you know, higher than some others. You still wind up with a low glycemic load. Now let's take a look at this potato, just peeled and baked. Yeah, it's up there. It's one of the higher ones on the index, but the actual carbs per serving means that you are pretty low. And now again, obviously low, 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 low. And this is just something that you want to take into consideration. If you're ever the, I don't want to say the lonely nerd, but if that's something you find yourself wanting to do, go under this index, figure out on average, you know, what do you eat on average? Pick a week, pick, you know, 5 foods throughout the week, and figure out what kind of a load are you putting on your body. And one way to mitigate this load is typically, and don't hold me to this 100%, but if we're just going to do a blanket statement, foods that are higher in fiber and protein, so it's going to be your cruciferous vegetables or most of your veggies outside of starches. And again, there's no issue with starches. It's just dependent upon how much you eat and what you cook them at, or how you cook them. But veggies and meats, if you're not a vegetarian, at a lower fat content rate, and you don't want to go too low because fat isn't bad. It's just we have to understand its role, is going to result in a typically lower glycemic index or glycemic load in your system, which means we can then start to control the inflammation going throughout their body and the things in the background that you might not have even noticed. Poor sleep quality, excessive joint pain that you can't explain, that you just think is associated with old age when it's probably not. Just those different things that you don't know are there or are just starting to be there, you'd be surprised at how many actually go away. Like, I can't tell you how many people have talked to me about their own personal stories. You know, the classic one is diabetes. Like, oh, I was pre-diabetic. You know, my fasting glucose is like 120 or 130, so right in the upper range of that pre-diabetic state. Or if anybody knows what a blood test A1C is, that's a better determinant of your actual blood glucose levels throughout a period of time. You want that number to be roughly around a 6 or lower. If it's above a 6, so it's like a 6 to 8, that's pre-diabetic state. Once it's above 8, they just say, yep, you're diabetic. It's a matter of, I've had a lot of people tell me where they are in one of these stages. You know, A1C is 7.4, or fasting glucose is 120, a little bit of weight loss, controlled nutrition. A few months later, they're testing these levels and it just goes down. And a lot of the times they think that, well, I didn't really lose any weight, but my knee pain went from a 4 to a 1 or 2. I can walk up farther, I can jog again, I want to do these things. And that's why I'm going to be shooting this inflammation video and covering more of the actual aspects of what goes into inflammation. I'm going to try and make it more palatable because, again, I'm assuming you guys are like me, where I've been in those biochemistry talks where they're talking about it and you just zone out. I mean, I mean, when we actually break down, here's the cell, here's the messenger, here's how it gets across the barrier, here's what happens, here's this, and then you have to know this fancy terminology. No, you lose me. So I'm going to try and make it more palatable. I'm going to shoot that video tomorrow, but again, the purpose of this video was just to show you there is such a thing as glycemic index and glycemic load. It's an average estimate about how different foods impact your body in response to glucose levels. It's a very pertinent item to talk about when we're going to be dealing with inflammation. And index and load, while they're related, you got to put it in perspective, which is why you have that little bit of an equation, and why I wanted to show you this index here. Is even though we have potatoes lying all the way down this chart here, they each have a different load. They have a different average carb per serving, which will have a different impact on your body. And it's just, again, to get you thinking. That's the whole purpose of this video. So stay tuned. I look forward to shooting the next one either tonight or tomorrow, but you'll have both of these videos posted within the next day or two of me making this. So thank you for sticking around, guys. If you have any questions, again, reach out to me. I love doing these for you. Until then, you guys have a great weekend. Bye.